The old Victorian house on Whisperwood Lane had always been a point of quiet contention in the Miller family. Not because it was haunted, not explicitly, but because it hummed with a specific, almost electrical tension, a legacy passed down like a genetic predisposition to melancholia. Evelyn Miller, matriarch of the family, had always been difficult, not unkind, necessarily, but distant, prone to long silences and intense, private rituals in her attic studio, where she sculpted unsettling, lifelike figures from clay and human hair. Her daughter, Mara Miller, inherited Evelyn's artistic bent, but channeled it into hyper-realistic botanical illustrations. Mara tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy in her own life with her husband, David, a steady, good-natured history teacher, and their two children. Raven, 16, a bright, sensitive girl with an unusual penchant for collecting old lockets, and 10-year-old Leo, who had an odd, almost ethereal calmness about him and a peculiar habit of mimicking bird calls. The story truly began with Evelyn's death. Not sudden, but protracted. A slow fade from a rare neurological condition that left her mind intact but her body failing. The funeral was a sparse affair, attended mostly by distant relatives and a few of Evelyn's eccentric art associates. Mara, despite their complicated relationship, felt the familiar ache of unresolved grief, tangled with a sense of relief she was ashamed to acknowledge. Raven cried silently, clutching an antique locket her grandmother had given her years ago. Leo, however, sat impassively, occasionally tilting his head as if listening to something no one else could hear. In the weeks following, the Miller house, now Mara's responsibility, felt heavier. Mara found herself drawn to Evelyn's attic studio, a space she had rarely entered in her mother's lifetime. The air was thick with the scent of clay and something else older, like dried herbs and dust. The sculptures stared out with hollow eyes, some featuring tiny, braided locks of hair woven into their clay forms. One, a miniature of Evelyn herself, sat on a dusty workbench, its eyes unervingly lifelike. One particularly sweltering afternoon, a pigeon flew headfirst into the living room window, a sickening thud. Leo, who was playing nearby, simply watched it fall, then walked outside and picked up the bird, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. He didn't seem distressed, merely curious. It was trying to get in, he told Mara, his voice flat. The incidents started small, almost imperceptible. Mara would wake to the faint scent of something burning, only to find nothing amiss. Objects would subtly shift, a book on the shelf, a teacup on the counter. David, ever pragmatic, dismissed it as stress or old house quirks. Raven, however, grew increasingly withdrawn, spending hours in her room with the locket clutched in her hand, sketching disturbing, intricate patterns in her notebook that resembled the symbols on Evelyn's sculptures. Then came the accident. It was Raven's friend, Maya's, party, a typical suburban teenage gathering. Raven, overwhelmed by social anxiety and a lingering sense of unease, asked David to take Leo home early. On the drive, Leo, who had been unusually quiet, started making a series of strange, guttural clicking noises from the back seat, sounds David couldn't place. Annoyed, David told him to stop. Leo immediately fell silent. As David was driving home along a winding, tree-lined road, a deer suddenly bolted across the path. David swerved violently, tires screeching. The car slammed into a large, ancient oak tree. The impact was brutal. David, stunned but conscious, felt a searing pain in his arm. He looked into the back seat, dread coiling in his stomach. Leo wasn't there. His window was shattered, and the rear of the car was crumpled. Then, David saw it a small, still form under the shattered tree branch, a few yards from the car. Leo. His head was turned at a horrifying angle, completely severed from his body, lying unnaturally on the damp earth. The next few weeks were a living hell. Mara's grief was a physical entity, a crushing weight that left her barely functional. She blamed David, not overtly, but in the brittle silences, the hollow stares. David, consumed by guilt, could barely look at her, or at Raven, who was now a ghost of herself, drifting through the house, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed. Raven's grief manifested in a terrifying new way. She became obsessed with her grandmother's locket. She started sleepwalking, and Mara would find her in the attic, surrounded by Evelyn's sculptures, murmuring to herself. One night, Mara heard a faint scratching sound from Raven's room. She found Raven clawing at her own reflection in a mirror, whispering Evelyn's name. Mara, desperate for answers, for any explanation for their unbearable suffering, started attending a grief support group. There, she met Joan, an older woman with kind, weary eyes, who seemed to understand her pain with an unnerving empathy. Joan spoke of contacting the deceased of closure through spiritual means. Mara, initially skeptical, felt a desperate flicker of hope. Joan introduced Mara to the idea of a seance, a way to reach Leo. Mara, emotionally raw, agreed. They held it in Mara's living room after David and Raven had gone to bed. Joan brought a small, carved wooden box and a few other items. As they sat around a candlelit table, Joan guided Mara through an invocation. Mara, overwhelmed, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The air grew heavy, the flame flickered wildly. Mara heard a faint whisper, a child's voice, calling Mommy. It wasn't Leo's voice, not really. It was distorted, ancient, but the intent was clear. Mara broke down, sobbing, feeling Leo's presence, cold and distant, yet undeniably there. Joan told her that the ritual had worked, that Leo was trying to communicate. After that night, things escalated. Mara started having vivid nightmares of Leo, his head eerily reattached, whispering warnings. She saw Evelyn's ghost, often in the attic, watching her. Raven's behavior grew more erratic. She started cutting off small locks of her own hair, weaving them into the miniature Evelyn sculpture in the attic. She began to draw a strange, recurring symbol, a circle with an arrow pointing upwards, bisected by a wavy line. Mara recognized it from Evelyn's old sketchbooks, buried deep within a locked drawer. David, trying to keep a grip on reality, noticed the strange smells in the house, the inexplicable drafts. He found Raven carving the same symbol into the wooden frame of her bed. When he confronted Mara about her new obsession with Joan and the seances, they fought bitterly. "You're unraveling, Mara," he pleaded. "This isn't healthy. Leo is gone." But Mara felt a burgeoning understanding, a horrifying clarity. Joan wasn't just a fellow grieving mother. Joan knew things. Joan knew about Evelyn. One day, Mara found an old photo album in Evelyn's studio. Tucked inside was a grainy photograph of Evelyn, much younger, standing with a group of people she didn't recognize. And amongst them, smiling serenely, was Joan. A cold dread seeped into Mara's bones. She remembered the strange clicking noises Leo made, the way he picked up the dead pigeon. She remembered Raven's sudden interest in the locket, the disturbing sketches. It was all connected. Evelyn hadn't just been eccentric. She had been a part of something, a cult, and they had been watching them. One night, Mara awoke to Raven standing over her bed, holding a pair of large, rusty shears. Raven's eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with a horrifying, manic glee. "He wants a new body, Mommy," Raven whispered, her voice not her own, but deeper, ancient. "He's almost ready," Mara screamed, scrambling away. David burst in, tackling Raven. In the ensuing struggle, Raven dropped the shears and crumpled, sobbing, unaware of what she had done. Mara knew then, whatever Evelyn had been involved in, it hadn't ended with her death. It had simply transitioned. Evelyn hadn't just sculpted grotesque figures. She had been preparing vessels. And the locket, the symbols, the seances, they were all part of a plan to bring something back. Something malevolent, something that needed a new host. Raven was no longer Raven. Or rather, she was Raven, but also something else, a doorway. Mara, consumed by terror, locked Raven in her room. David, shaken but still trying to rationalize, tried to talk to Mara, but her eyes held a frantic, knowing glint. "It's Paimon," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Evelyn was serving Paimon, and now he's here. She remembered a recurring symbol in Evelyn's art, an image of a headless figure, crowned, with a child's head at its feet. The horrific image of Leo's severed head flashed in her mind. It was a sacrifice. He was the offering. Mara raced back to Evelyn's studio, frantically tearing through old sketchbooks and journals. She found a loose page, a fragment of a letter, referring to the lineage and the perfect host. It was written in Evelyn's elegant, spidery hand, but the words were chillingly cold. And there, tucked inside an old grimoire, was a photograph of Evelyn, Joan, and a group of others, all standing around a bizarre altar, adorned with the very same symbols Raven had been drawing. In the center of the altar lay a miniature clay figure, clearly recognizable as Leo. Mara's blood ran cold. Evelyn hadn't just predicted Leo's death. She had engineered it. They had been chosen. That night, as the full moon cast long, eerie shadows across the old house, Mara heard it, the distinct, guttural clicking sound Leo used to make, but coming from inside Raven's locked room. Then, a faint thud, as if something heavy had fallen. She crept to Raven's door, heart pounding. The clicking grew louder, more insistent. She peered through the keyhole. Raven was no longer in her bed. She was standing in the center of the room, completely naked, her back to the door. Her body was contorted, her limbs bending at unnatural angles, her head tilted at an impossible degree. On the floor around her were pieces of the miniature Evelyn sculpture, shattered. And then, slowly, Raven's head began to turn. Not her body, just her head, revolving unnaturally until it faced Mara. Her eyes completely black, devoid of pupils. A thin, reedy voice, not Raven's, but ancient and mocking, emanated from her lips. "Welcome, Mother." Mara stumbled back, screaming, the sound tearing from her throat. David, awakened by her cries, rushed out, bewildered, demanding to know what was happening. "It's Paimon," Mara shrieked, pointing at Raven, who was now slowly turning her entire body to face them, her movements jerky and unnatural. "He's in her. He was always going to be in one of them." Suddenly, from the shadows of the hallway, figures emerged. Joan was there, along with two other women Mara vaguely recognized from Evelyn's funeral. They were all naked, their bodies painted with the symbols Mara had seen in Evelyn's books. They moved with a terrifying grace, silent and deliberate. David, utterly disoriented, tried to shield Mara. "What is this? Get out of my house." One of the figures, with unnerving speed, lunged at David, seizing him. Another began to chant, a low, guttural drone that vibrated through the very foundations of the house. Raven, still with those black, empty eyes, let out a series of bird-like clicks that turned into a bone-chilling shriek. Mara, her mind snapping, knew what she had to do. This wasn't her daughter anymore. This wasn't her family. This was Evelyn's legacy, a horrifying inheritance she had unknowingly been cultivating. She saw a flicker of movement in the attic window, the glow of candles, and heard the faint, sickening sound of chanting. She had to stop it. She had to end it. Driven by a desperate, primal instinct, Mara raced up the stairs, past the chanting figures, past David struggling against his captors. The attic door was ajar. Inside, the room was bathed in the flickering light of dozens of candles. In the center, on a raised dais, sat a makeshift altar, and on it, surrounded by the shattered pieces of the clay figures, was the miniature Evelyn sculpture, its eyes now glowing faintly. But it wasn't the sculpture that caught her eye. Hovering above the altar, seemingly coalescing from the shadows, was a crowned, headless figure, its form indistinct, shimmering, yet unmistakably present. And then, Raven was there, suddenly behind her, still clicking, still contorting. Mara whirled, grabbing a heavy, ornate wooden sculpture stand. With a guttural cry, fueled by a grief and terror that had reached its breaking point, she brought it down, again and again, on Raven's head, the sickening thuds echoing through the house. Raven crumpled, her body still clicking, twitching, then finally, mercifully, went still. Mara stood over her, breathing heavily, tears streaming down her face. She had killed her daughter. But had she? Or had she simply freed her? The chanting below grew louder, more frantic. The air in the attic thickened, turning cold and electric. The headless figure above the altar pulsed with an ominous light. Mara looked around, her eyes wild, desperate. She saw Evelyn's miniature self, lying shattered on the ground, and next to it, the old grimoire. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the bizarre symbols and Latin phrases. One passage caught her eye, a ritual for banishment, requiring a sacrifice, a blood offering, and a specific incantation. But it was not for banishment. It was for transfer. Mara looked at the headless figure, then at the still form of Raven, then at a glinting box of matches on a nearby shelf. A horrible, perverse thought, born of pure madness, seized her. If the demon needed a host, if it needed a lineage, then she would give it one. But not in the way they wanted. She grabbed the matches. The chanting below reached a fever pitch. Mara looked at the headless figure, its energy now radiating outwards, making the candles flicker violently. She looked at the grimoire, then at the shattered pieces of the miniature Evelyn, and finally, at a large, unlit candle on the altar, shaped like a human torso. With trembling hands, Mara lit the candle. The wax began to melt, slowly, steadily. She opened the grimoire to the page, repeating the Latin words, her voice a raw, broken whisper. The room began to spin. The headless figure swelled, its presence filling the attic. Below, the chanting abruptly stopped. A single, guttural scream tore through the house. David. Mara finished the incantation, her voice cracking. The candle flared brightly, then extinguished itself. The headless figure above the altar solidified, its form becoming clearer, more distinct, terrifyingly crowned. And then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its attention from the altar to Mara. Mara felt a searing coldness spread through her, an invasion, a complete and utter usurpation. Her own consciousness receded, like a tide pulling back from a shore, leaving behind an empty vessel. The last thing she saw, through eyes that were no longer her own, was the headless figure, now complete, sitting atop the miniature Evelyn sculpture, which had somehow reassembled itself. Downstairs, the members of the cult, led by Joan, watched as a figure, impossibly crowned, impossibly serene, descended the staircase from the attic. It was Mara's body, but the walk was different, the eyes completely black, unblinking. In its arms, it cradled the severed head of David, his eyes wide and frozen in terror. The figures knelt, bowing their heads in reverence. Joan smiled, a beatific, chilling smile. "All hail Paimon," she whispered, her voice filled with triumph. "All hail the newly crowned." The house on Whisperwood Lane was finally still, quiet. But the hum of tension, the legacy of Evelyn Miller, had not departed. It had simply been perfected. If it followed you, like the video, if you felt it watching, leave a comment. If you're not alone anymore, share this with someone. And subscribe to Creepy World. It remembers everyone who does.